All right, so here we are getting into our last chapter of the year, which is going to be chapter 32, what they call the age of globalization. Um, Somewhat, I would say that. And obviously, in the background, you see the Twin Towers because that is certainly a thing of symbolic importance in modern America, the America of the 21st century. This chapter's kind of an interesting one because, frankly, so much of the stuff is recent. And one thing about history is it's hard to put it into perspective until many years after it happens. The things happening today, the pandemic, um, the current and previous presidencies, we won't really have real perspective on them um, until long after they're over. So really, the stuff that's happening now, um, by the time I retire from teaching, whenever that is probably these events and things are probably just going to come into historical focus, and that's a long ways away. So, it's kind of interesting how to approach and talk about these things. So the tone of these notes might be a little bit different than some of the other stuff, or most of the other stuff that we've had throughout the year. But let's go ahead and get started by talking a little bit about the presidency of Bill Clinton. An interesting presidency. Now, Bill Clinton is kind of a tale of two guys. There's the president and there's the man. Um, and the man certainly has his moral shortcomings and failures. The presidency, though, generally speaking, which his presidency now began about 30 years ago, or a little bit less than 30 years ago, is just starting to kind of come into historical perspective and focus. Uh, and so that's an important thing to note um, as we kind of look forward into history. Uh, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the presidency of Clinton. Now, Bill Clinton gets elected in 1992, fairly comfortably over George H.W. Bush, Daddy Bush, because he's young and seems essentially to be more in touch with the needs of the American people in a time when the American people wanted uh, some degree of change. There had been kind of the resurgence of conservatism beginning with Reagan and continuing with George H.W. Bush, and Clinton brings back because, again, cause and effect, ebbs and flows in politics, people move, um, during this era, kind of move from Republican to Democrat fairly easily and consistently. People want to change, and that's what they get in Bill Clinton. Um, Interestingly enough, his election in 1992 uh, brings back a fair deal of what we call partisanship, and kind of unfairly so. In retrospect, Bill Clinton, though a Democrat, uh, is a very moderate Democrat. Uh, his policies and many of the things he does are very moderate. And Bill Clinton is a very skilled politician. He worked very well with, relative to, especially in particular, our more recent presidents. He worked very well with Congress, whether it was a Republican or a Democratic Congress, and this benefited our economy during the 1990s. Now, when he arrives in the presidency in 1992, or early 1993, rather, of course, we're still kind of in the midst of the recession that began in late 1990. By 1994, we start to climb out of that um, economic downturn, in part because of the policies of the Clinton administration and his ability to work with Congress. And as time would go on, also largely in part because of the internet boom that took place in the second half of the 1990s. So that's an important thing to consider as well. Now, in 1992, of course, the Democrats take back the White House and they still have control of the House and Senate. In 1994, for the first time in several decades, the Republicans take back both the House of Representatives and the Senate, now are the majority. So now we have a Democratic White House and a Republican House and Senate. And oftentimes that results in partisan action. Like we see nowadays, Republicans don't want to pass, a lot of the stuff that the Biden administration is putting out, just as the Democrats didn't want to pass a lot of the things that the Trump administration put out, and the partisanship is big. It wasn't as bad back in the 90s, but it was certainly coming back, led by Republican Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. Now, Gingrich was very conservative and was in support of conservative principles such as tax cuts and things like that. The interesting thing about this, right? The Democrats or the Republicans, sought things that conservatives typically seek. Things of a strong moral equivalency, tax cuts, the typical Republican conservative slate. And at one point, Newt Gingrich shuts down the government for several days because he couldn't agree with the president on a budget for, I believe, 1995 or 6. Gingrich thinks this will bring about support for Republican policies, but ultimately it fails. It backfires for the Republicans, largely in part of kind of a I would call genius political move on the part of Clinton. While the Republicans propose these tax cut ideas, Clinton too proposes his own ideas for tax cuts, which kind of undercut the Republican goal and ultimately make the Republicans look like the bad guys that are holding up government and productivity, and Clinton looked like the guy who's the good guy who's willing to work with the other side to do what's right for the American people. This is the skill of Bill Clinton as a more centrist Republican centrist Democrat in terms of policy making. He's able to grow his popularity throughout his presidency, despite the many personal challenges that he faces during his presidency, which we'll get into in a little bit. This ends up working very well for him. In terms of policy, among these policies that, of course, there's lots of disagreement, but America was used to a Democratic president who's going to pursue primarily social reforms, Great Society, New Deal, stuff of that nature. Bill Clinton's a little bit different. The policies that he pursues are ones that most notably have to do with like trade and stuff like that. That's where NAFTA comes in. NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement, which reduced barriers to trade amongst countries in North America like Canada, Mexico primarily, which on the one hand helps make goods and products more affordable for consumers. The downside of that, of course, is it opens up the door for more jobs to be shipped off to places like Mexico and other countries, which of course some people don't like that. So, as with any political policy, there's winners and there's losers, there's positives and there's negatives. For the consumer, NAFTA generally is good. For the jobs market, labor-intensive jobs, maybe not as much. Okay, so take that with what you will, and determine whether or not that's something that is a win or loss for the country. The other big policy issue of the Clinton administration. Now, remember, we're in the 1990s, so the Cold War is over. The United States has won. The Soviet Union is gone. So, who becomes our new threats or America's role in the world? How is it going to change? And like I said in the last video, in the last video when we talked about the Gulf War, America now is looking for what is our role in the world now that we've won the Cold War. And under Clinton, as well as under George H.W. Bush, and really son of Bush too, George W. Bush, our role is to be kind of the arbiter of peace around the world. One place where there was a lot of unrest is the former Yugoslavia, which was several broken up states now, including Bosnia. In the mid 1990s, America starts to get heavily involved in the conflict in Bosnia and Serbia and Herzegovina and those places, trying again to be kind of the arbiter of goodness and peace in the world. This is the big foreign policy piece of the Clinton administration. The 1990s were a time, and I lived through them, where, other than once the Gulf War ended, America wasn't really embroiled in any conflicts or wars. In fact, the 1990s on a whole, worldwide, were generally a time, more or less, there were a couple conflicts here and there, but more or less were a time of general harmony and peace in the world, as much as you could ever expect there to be. And with very few major foreign policy issues to deal with, that really helps Clinton during his presidency to, look good and America to look good, because it seems that, now with America being the lone superpower in the world, we're presiding over a time where, the world is generally at peace. And for the most part, in the 1990s, save for, some third world country issues like the Rwandan genocide and Somalia and a couple other places, that largely was the case. But the one place we are involved is in Bosnia, which was a very bloody and civil war type conflict, in which the wounds from that, even today, many years later, are still very existent for the people in the former Yugoslavia. So 1996 rolls around, and Bill Clinton again is up for re-election. And in the election of 1996, Bill Clinton wins a comfortable election over Republican candidate Bob Dole, who seemed in many ways a copy of George H.W. Bush, an older guy who seemed a little bit out of touch with the wants and needs of an increasingly younger America. Remember, in the 1990s, the people that are running America are the baby boomer children, right? They're the children of the greatest generation. They're the ones that have come of age, or in their 40s, 50s, and 40s and 50s by this point, and they're running the country. And Bill Clinton is one of them, right? Just like John F. Kennedy was a baby boomer parent, right? I hope you understand the difference there. What I'm saying is, like, John F. Kennedy could have been, well, no, he couldn't have been. But John F. Kennedy is the baby boomer parent, and Bill Clinton is the baby boomer child, right? His parents were the greatest generation, just as John Kennedy was the greatest generation. So he kind of was reminiscent of that to some degree. And he speaks to this next younger generation of Americans, a big portion of the voting population, and Clinton wins a comfortable election in 1996, winning less than a majority, almost 50% of the vote, a little under that. He wins by about 9 points over Bob Dole, and even more comfortably in the Electoral College. So we'll take a look, I think, at that map right here, right? So interesting thing to note. People weren't excited about the election in 1996. Probably part of that reason is there's not a Cold War. There's not a major thing in the country that it's important that we pick somebody for the future of the country. Opinions weren't so divided, right? Older people like Bob Dole, Republicans like Bob Dole, younger people like Bill Clinton. The vote plays out. Clinton wins comfortably. But notice only 49% of the electorate voting. That's one of the lowest, maybe the lowest we had in the entirety of the 20th century. So not a lot of political enthusiasm at this time. So let's talk a little bit about the second Clinton administration. So the second term of Bill Clinton starts off okay. The economy's doing good. Clinton pursues a balanced budget amendment, which ultimately, for the first time, creates a 5-year string which goes into the second Bush presidency of actually having a government surplus, meaning we're not increasing the federal deficit, we're actually lowering it a little bit. Okay, so the government is actually spending less money than we budget for, which we love to see, and hasn't happened again since. But the big story of the second term of Bill Clinton is obviously to do with his moral failures. And like I said before, there's Bill Clinton, the president, who, in full disclosure, when I was growing up in the 1990s, I was not a big Bill Clinton fan. Had I been able to vote, I wouldn't have voted for him in 92 or 96. But in hindsight, as a mature adult, like I said before, his policies and his leadership during his presidency tended to be generally good for the economy and good for America. And he's presiding over a time where we don't have a Cold War to fight. We don't have a whole lot of major issues. And that's what brings sharply into focus during Clinton's second term Bill Clinton the man. And Bill Clinton the man has, as I say here, several moral shortcomings. And this most notably comes out in the well-publicized sex scandals involving Paula Jones and, most notably Monica Lewinsky, okay, which of course leads to Clinton's impeachment. Now, Paula Jones was a woman who accused Clinton of sexual harassment while he was governor of Arkansas in the 1980s and 90s. What brought this to light was another scandal involving the Clintons called the Whitewater Affair, because everything has to have a name. So the Whitewater Affair basically was regarding the Clintons maybe being involved in some basically shady real estate development dealings in Arkansas during the 1980s. And of course, because of the partisanship of politics at the time, they hire a special prosecutor, independent counsel, like Archibald Cox or Robert Mueller. In this case, it's a guy by the name of Ken Starr. And in that investigation, they find out about Paula Jones. Meanwhile, while this is happening, stories begin to surface about Monica Lewinsky, an intern for President Clinton, who allegedly had a sexual relationship with him, which Clinton, of course, denied. Now, like in the Watergate thing, the crime itself, alleged crime, is not as bad as the cover-up that goes along with it. And Clinton doesn't really learn the lesson that well from Richard Nixon. It's not a crime in itself by legal standards to have an affair, whether you're president or whether you're just some random person. Morally, of course, it's a failing. Morally, of course, it's criminal. If there's a moral prison, that would be a form of guilt. But what Clinton does here that ultimately gets him in trouble and gets him impeached is the fact that he lies about it. In other words, he commits the crime of perjury when he is called to testify and he vehemently denies having a sexual relationship with Lewinsky. Ultimately, information surfaces that he did indeed do it. He has to kind of eat crow and admit to it, and does it basically in a press conference on national TV, as the president often does, owns his mistake, kind of politically smart, trying to draw compassion from people, saying, I want to go back to work for the American people, famously, and stuff like that. And that is the crux of the Clinton sex scandal. Morally and in terms of character, Clinton is corrupted and weakened, obviously, by all of this. However, because the economy is absolutely blowing up in the late 1990s. Jobs are everywhere, new opportunities are everywhere, everything's good. People quickly forget he's doing a great job with the economy. Um, Money's good, jobs are good, everybody's employed, everybody's happy. The internet is blowing up everywhere. I remember my first couple years in college. Uh, Everybody coming out of college was getting jobs with like internet startups and something web related, and obviously it's common now because there's so much more out there. But this is the beginning of that, and when it's just starting up, there's so much opportunity for people to get involved in there and make a lot of money. So Clinton is the beneficiary here of um, not being convicted in his impeachment and kicked out because people look at it, everybody looks at it. At the end of the day, they say, you know, from a political standpoint and economic standpoint, things are going pretty good. And like Bill Clinton said in his campaign in 1992, it's all about the economy. The economy's stupid, and that is, at the end of the day, what matters most to people. So, like I said, Clinton gets acquitted of any wrongdoing in the impeachment. He still goes down as our second impeached president. Um, but we move on quickly. It helps also that to kind of distract attention from it, as the tensions in Bosnia were increasing, Bosnia, Serbia, the former Yugoslavia, same general place. We set off a series of bombings to kind of, in Serbia, to kind of stop the problems and incursions over there, and also to kind of take the attention away from the whole Clinton thing. At the end of the day, Bill Clinton leaves the presidency, rare for a president, with a higher approval rating than what his approval rating was when he became president. Normally, you don't see that. In the case of Bill Clinton, you do. The economy's good, things are good, people are happy. So, this takes us to the election of 2000, the first presidential election I ever actually voted in. Now, the election of 2000 pits familiar people: Vice President Al Gore and son of Bush, George W. Bush. Uh, it's a pretty close race throughout. It's a tough primary for George W. Bush. He faces tough competition, particularly from John McCain, who ran for president that year, but Bush wins the nomination. There was no doubt on the Democratic side who was going to get the nomination. Al Gore was the fine with, I guess, vice president to Bill Clinton. And it seemed that, unlike previous elections where, Clinton had run against older guys, both of these guys were relatively close in age, so they appealed to kind of similar demographics. Neither one was particularly crazy on one side of the political aisle, not super conservative on the side of Bush. A little bit more liberal than Clinton was Al Gore, but nothing too crazy. And ultimately, the election of 2000 would be extremely close and extremely controversial. This all comes down to Florida. So when the votes are tallied, Al Gore wins the popular vote. For only the third time in our country's history, the man that wins the popular vote loses the Electoral College by what amounted to, what broke down to Florida. And at first count, Bush had won Florida by a scant number of only about 300 votes. The Gore campaign, of course, says we want a recount, which they can do. They call for a recount, and nothing definitive comes out. They call for another recount. Gore continues to kind of whine about it, how he must have won, this can't be right, blah, 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 whatever. This goes on for about a month. Before finally the Supreme Court has to step in and say enough is enough. So even though the election date was, I want to say like to the 8th, maybe, of November. In any event, right? In any event, November passes. We get into December. We still have no president declared. And then finally, on December 12th, 2000, the Supreme Court basically says enough is enough. The final count is where it is. Bush actually gained a couple hundred votes. I think the total was around between 500 and 600. And 527 maybe was the number. I'm not sure. You'll never be asked that question. And of course, Al Gore, but George W. Bush becomes the new president of the United States, despite losing the popular vote by around half a total percent. So there you go. So that is pretty much the notes I have for this one. Let me know if you have any questions, and we will continue on tomorrow. All right. See you later. Oh, yeah. So sorry. Here's a look at the map from 2000. You'll notice not much more enthusiasm about voting in 2000, but very close election, the closest we've ever had. And like I said, about 0.5% separates Clinton and Gore. So anyway, that's that. We will see you next time.